The ranking member, but boy, I thoroughly disagree with him on his statement. He spoke about the Senate bill, and I just want to briefly speak about that, even if we're digressing for a moment. The Senate bill was awful. It was terrible. In fact, the supposed conservative senator who helped to put this together is censured in his own state for what he did by the legislature there. The bill didn't finish building the wall. This terrible bill didn't expedite sending people back to the country of origin. This bill didn't maintain or actually put in place again, which worked, the Remain in Mexico policy. This bill didn't stop catch and release. That's only mentioning a few. It actually codified, it made legal what is an illegal activity. I don't get what some folks refuse to get about this. We have all the issues and the problems that we have now because we're allowing an illegal activity to take place and pretending that it's legal. It reminds me, in some jurisdictions where they're trying, liberal prosecutors, to reduce penalties from felonies to misdemeanors so they can say their felony count has gone down and that their city is getting safer. You can't codify, you can't make legal illegal activity. And that's, one of the many problems with the Senate bill. It was literally better to do nothing than to do that Senate bill. It wasn't compromised, it wasn't good, it was completely unfocused and wrong, and I think we've seen that. And that's why it didn't even come up for a vote in the Senate. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump, it has nothing to do with the House. At the end of the day, they couldn't even get it up for a vote. I know Ms. Jackson Lee, no, actually it was the ranking member mentioned Georgia. And I thought he was going to mention the case of Lincoln Riley in Georgia, innocent young college student who was murdered by somebody who was illegal and shouldn't have been on the street. It's just common sense, man. I mean, I don't know what we're doing in this country. You can't bring this woman's life back. For all the talking points you may have, she's dead. And then finally, addressing the amendment, there is a mechanism for this. And I could go through, I won't, all of the precedent in the immigration courts over and over again. We now already can detain people, especially when we consider them dangerous, who have only been accused. This is nothing new. It's nothing we haven't done before, but we need to enforce it. And if there is something wrong, if it is a mistaken identity, if it is a problem where somebody shouldn't have been accused or shouldn't be detained or shouldn't be deported, they are going to have their day in the immigration court. Due diligence will be served with this legislation. I support it. We need to pass it. I think we need to show the American people, for God's sake, that we're trying to do something to stop what's happening.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will yield.
I'm very curious about the mention you made of the Senate bill that it would codify something that is currently illegal. Would you mind sharing with us what you're talking about?
Sure. I reclaim my time. It would allow up to close to 2 million illegal aliens to be processed and pushed through into our country every year. And if the president chose to, he could change the ceiling and allow more than that. Supposedly there was a maximum limit, but it gives him the jurisdiction to go ahead and actually increase that number. That's wrong. That's not what people are looking for. We need to button up the border. Once the border is buttoned up and we know that we're safer, then we can look at immigration laws and look at the areas that need to be adjusted to allow good, legal immigrants that love this country. When you see, and I'm going to talk about this later, but when you see that there were individuals in New York who were beating the daylights, a ton of them beating the daylights out of 2 cops, and then they did get arrested. They were released the next day, and as they walked out, they gave the double middle finger to the United States of America and to all of us. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, let me tell you about, and I spoke about this last time, the legal immigrants that we want in America are people who love this country and pledge their support for the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am rising in strong support of my colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee's amendment. It is a very good amendment. It would simply bring the bill more in line with current law by requiring that an individual actually be convicted of or admit to committing a robbery offense in order to be subject to mandatory detention. That seems like a very reasonable amendment, and I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will support it. Last month, my Republican colleagues were busy trying to deport immigrants, including lawful permanent residents, without requiring a conviction before removal. Today, they want to subject immigrants, including those in a lawful status, like DACA or TPS, to mandatory detention, even if they are never charged with a crime. When it comes to immigration, it seems that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can only think in terms of enforcement, even though that very enforcement-only approach has proven to be wholly ineffective. Even the most draconian immigration laws have not prevented people from seeking refuge here, and expanding the mandatory detention criteria will not keep us safer. The Immigration and Nationality Act has impossible requirements that no administration has ever been able to meet, and no Congress has ever appropriated sufficient funds to detain everybody that is listed in the current mandatory detention categories. And despite that fact, my Republican colleagues' answer is they want to expand those categories. Under this bill, a wide range of people, including DACA and TPS recipients, would be subject to mandatory detention simply for being arrested for a robbery offense. It doesn't matter that these individuals may never actually be charged with a crime, or that their arrest could be a case of mistaken identity, as the ranking member described. Arrests due to mistaken identity are bad enough, but as Mr. Massey discussed in an earlier iteration of this markup, there are real concerns about racial disparities in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools. In one particularly egregious case, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified by an automatic facial recognition search. At the time of her arrest, she was 8 months pregnant. The police handcuffed her in front of her crying daughters and her fiancé and held her for 11 hours before she was released on a $100,000 bond. Prosecutors did not dismiss the case against her for another month. If the woman had been on DACA or TPS, under this bill, ICE would have been required to pick her up upon her release, and her son would have been born in immigration detention. And this is all despite the fact that she did absolutely nothing wrong. This bill is a very serious and broad expansion of current law. It's also unnecessary, by the way. Immigrants who admit to or are convicted of serious robbery offenses are subject to mandatory detention under the Immigration and Nationality Act, and there's no justification for an expansion that mandates detention for those who are simply arrested or charged with robbery. People are often wrongfully arrested, or they're arrested and never charged with a crime. Right now, ICE is detaining more people than Congress has authorized funds for. Even still, this administration, like every other administration before it, is not even close to detaining everyone in the mandatory detention categories. I also worry that this legislation will make communities less safe. Under this bill, an individual that is subject to mandatory detention would have an immigration detainer placed on them so that they can be picked up by the Department of Homeland Security. For this to work, local law enforcement agencies would have to hold the immigrant until ICE is able to take custody. Local law enforcement agencies, however, need to have the trust of all of the members of their community, including immigrants, to effectively do their job. But that trust can be eroded if state and local law enforcement officers are viewed by the immigrant community as working on behalf of ICE. The Major Cities Chiefs Association has specifically addressed this issue, stating that lack of trust in local law enforcement can, quote, result in increased crime against immigrants in the broader community, create a class of silent victims, and eliminate the potential for assistance from immigrants in solving crimes or preventing future terroristic acts, end quote. Instead of working together on a bipartisan solution to fix the broken immigration system, here we are marking up a bill that has zero chance of becoming law. I hope my colleagues will work with us to pass this amendment and to accomplish a real goal of addressing immigration instead of passing more flawed bills like this. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know who's subject to mandatory detention? Anybody charged with robbery in federal court. U.S. citizen, non-U.S. citizen, anybody. It's a presumptive detention hold. Like it or not, illegal immigrants who are in this country are under the subject of federal jurisdiction. This isn't changing or expanding the law. It's allowing another federal agency to enact the law in the same way as which the federal court system does. That is the only difference. You want to talk about pretrial release reform in federal court, I'm your guy. Like, I'll sit down and work with anybody. But the reality is, if you're charged with robbery in federal court, you are going to be detained. The only difference here is we're asking another federal agency to apply the law in the same exact manner in which the federal court system applies the law. That's it. They are under federal jurisdiction. We wish they weren't. We wish they weren't here illegally, but when they are, they're under federal jurisdiction, not just the state in which they're in. All we're doing is applying the same rule to them that we apply to anybody else who is charged with this crime in federal court. Sure, we're moving it from one agency to the other in case they're charged in state court instead of federal court. If you're talking about wrongful detention, innocent until proven guilty, mistaken identity, I think there's a lot of people sitting in federal detention all across the country right now that would love to have that conversation because they don't get out.
Yeah.
There is no bond in federal court. You're either released or you're detained. All we're doing is saying that if you are an illegal immigrant and there is jurisdiction over you federally, we're going to treat you like anybody else who's arrested and charged federally. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?